What is going on, ladies and gentlemen? Welcome back to another video. In this one we'll be doing the real world circuit to land in the Mirage 2000. This is the one that's flown by the French Air Force, although in our particular case we're using what's supposed to be the Hellenic Air Force Mirage 2000 EG, which is broadly similar to Mirage 2000C. So with that said, sit back and enjoy. We have 2 good engine starts. You're clear to disconnect the headset. We'll see you on the left with the pin. Thanks a lot. Alright, here we are, Hellenic Air Force Mirage 2000, approaching RAF at Trackir, landing on runway 10, switching to approach mode on the PCA, and you can also raise the seat slightly. Apparently that's what they do in real life for landing, probably one of the only aircraft in the world where the pilot has to raise the seat for landing. But such is life with these high alpha delta wing fighters. So we are looking at a target airspeed of 350 knots and a target height of 1,500 feet AGL, which is what we're about to descend down to now, and level off as we fly overhead the runway, overhead the airfield. And you guys know I'm all about precision flying, so it's all about the the speed and height. And if it's 10 feet out, it's not good enough, and if it's 1 knot out, it's not good enough. We should always be chasing perfection. At this point we do the brake, 60 degrees left turn in our case. At the same time the throttle comes back to idle and we get the speed brakes out all at once. And at this point we're maintaining that 60 degrees angle of bank all the way around until we get a speed to about 200 knots. 200 knots in that turn. We are now retracting the speed brake, getting the gear out, get the landing light on, and we're reducing the bank angle to 40 degrees. And at this point we're maintaining that, and it is sort of a ballpark figure, because it's difficult to see that in the Mirage HUD to know exactly what angle of bank you have, so don't worry about that too much. And we are rolling out on a reciprocal heading of about 290 degrees there, trying to maintain that 1,500 feet AGL and 200 knots. We're maintaining 200 knots, or as close as we possibly get it. At this point I utilize the autopilot altitude hold mode. You see there, Mirage is super nice to use with the autopilot, so find it, if you want to, you can use it. Obviously not for very long, just as we pass a beam the runway threshold, depending on the amount of headwind you have at that point, or tailwind in our case I suppose, in the downwind leg. You can extend that a little bit more. In our case we have a lot of headwind once we roll back out onto the runway heading, so no need to extend too much there. And we're starting a 40 degree angle of bank turn, and we're starting to descend now. Officially I think you should descend initially at 7 degrees, or you put the flight path vector 7 degrees nose down. I didn't do that. I think this is a little more of a fine art than a science, so I think that it's totally acceptable to not do that initially, and you should just maintain this now to get to 2 whites, 2 reds on the pappies, which is what we have. Gently roll out on the runway center line, and after that you should try and adjust your angle of attack to the appropriate landing setting of about 14 degrees, which is where we align the chevrons there with those little brackets, and keep that flight path vector on the touchdown zone markers as much as we can. Now the Mirage 2000 has become very twitchy and not very nice after the engine and flight model update very recently. In high alpha I find in general, but certainly at in the landing configuration. Now we do the flare, and unlike most aircraft I find you should not be chopping the power well before you start the flare. It's actually literally as you flare, as you finish the flare, you chop the power. In our case I actually did float just a tiny bit and then dropped. It's not the easiest aircraft to grease on, I find, the Mirage 2000. A little bit tricky. At this point, as soon as you got wheels on the ground, get the speed brakes out, which is what we've got now, and keep the inverted T on the horizon, keep the aerodynamic braking going, and also press the fly-by-wire reset switch so that we don't get any master caution warnings as the nose descends down here and touches down. So at this point you can still keep, as you can see, the elevons. I believe they're called the elevons. Somebody can correct me if Delta Wing aircraft, these control surfaces are not called elevons, but I believe they're the elevons. Keep the stick back so that they're deflected upwards. Still gives you a little bit of extra aerodynamic braking, and you take off some of the stress on the wheel brakes. At this point we are turning off the runway and we are going to turn the landing light into the taxi light configuration. At the same time we'll retract the speed brake, the air brake. Actually, I'm not entirely sure how Mirage or Dassault calls it. And we will turn the radar into standby mode, not to give anybody cancer on the ground, which is what we've done there. And in real life you'd probably be switching the transponder off, or the mode S of the transponder off, but in DCS it's not really important or necessary. Not that we use the transponder for anything at all really, so it doesn't really matter. So we're taxiing into the heavies ramp, which today is occupied by a detachment of Hellenic Air Force Mirage 2000s and F-16s, and this is actually for a mission that I've been working on that I might share with you guys, that I'm trying to create a really realistic air-to-air mission between the Hellenic Air Force and the Turks in their F-16s and F-4 Phantoms back in the early 90s, because I realized that nobody makes, well actually I lie, some people do make good content for DCS, but what really annoys me is that we have these amazing modules that basically come out and these awesome maps and some pretty cool environments as well, but it's the only game I've ever played where the developer says, here's some toys, now it's up to you to go and create a game out of it, which is a bit like buying Grand Theft Auto and just getting the main character, all the cars and stuff, and the map, but no missions, and then it's up to you to make the missions, which I find totally ridiculous. And I know there's some talented developers out there, but it's just not to my liking in terms of realism and level of detail. So I've taken upon myself to create something that's really air combat focused, and something that is based on a very realistic scenario, which in my case will be back in the early 90s when Russia tried to sell the S-300 SAMs to Cyprus, and Turkey got all wound up about it and vouched to invade Cyprus unless that problem was resolved somehow. In the end it was resolved. The Greeks, who are responsible for defending Cyprus, apparently, they swapped out the S-300s for some TORs, for some TOR surface-to-air missiles, and the conflict never really came to be. But in my plausible scenario, the Cyprus has decided that they are not going to do that, and they kept the S-300s, and Turkey became all hostile about it, and the Hellenic Air Force is now engaged defending Cyprus with some help from the Royal Air Force against the Turkish F-16s and F-4s. So in one of my future missions you guys will see that. I've been working on that and be trying to create it in a very realistic scenario, which is why you see a whole bunch of aircraft parked here on the ramp, sort of try to create some realistic environment. So if you're interested, please make sure to subscribe to the channel, and hopefully I shall share that with you at some point. But for now, please make sure to like and subscribe, and check out my new website for buying and selling aircraft, WINGLIST, with the most detailed aircraft listings out there. With that said, ladies and gentlemen, hope you've enjoyed it. Hopefully catch you in the next one. Adios.